Welcome to 1000 Actually Fun Books, where we review books of every genre, looking for the best of fun escapist books. Today we're reviewing Ivanhoe by Sir Walter Scott. So this is a classic, very much in every sense of the word. This is about 200 years old when this was originally written. It is a historical fiction and an adventure and just definitely a classic. You can find this on Project Gutenberg and other places online for free because it is so old it's in the public domain. I will have a link down below in my description for a public domain version of this. So the plot of this takes place in the Crusader era, and it is not strictly about Ivanhoe, although he is definitely a large part of this. This has kind of got a whole cast of characters in England. It takes place, we'll just say the Crusader era. So what happens is that our Ivanhoe returns, and he has been disinherited from his father, Cedric the Saxon. So Cedric has disinherited him. You don't find out until almost like a third of the way through the book why, and it's not a very good reason, I don't think. It's very political, but he's been disinherited, so he is a nobody. And there's a bunch of other people that are there. That this is during the time of King Richard the Lionheart being out at crusading, and Prince John is trying to take the throne. So if you recognize those characters from Robin Hood is also in this story, although you again don't recognize him right away because he's not given out by name. You will recognize him by his deeds long before you ever get to his name. But anyway, he's got a pretty big part in this book, which I was surprised about before I read it. I didn't realize Robin Hood was in Ivanhoe. Anyway, so Ivanhoe returns and finds out what's going on, and it starts out as people preparing for a tournament, a joust, a knightly combat, and Ivanhoe is going to be part of that. So they have a big tournament, and Ivanhoe is wounded. And during this, some of his enemies, he's got 3 main enemies, although some of them don't actually care about him directly. It's kind of a larger story. You know, they're against his father, or they're greedy, or they want the girl, things like that. So anyway, so after the joust and he's wounded, he and his companions are captured, and this kind of outrages Robin Hood because the villains in this dress themselves up like Robin Hood's merry men in Lincoln Green, and so the Robin Hood is like, how rude, we're going to do something about that. So he is part of the rescue. Anyway, so Ivanhoe, his lady love Rowena, his father Cedric the Saxon, a couple other people, a Jew, Isaac of York, the Isaac of York's daughter, Rebecca. These are all really strong, big characters of the story. So they're all captured by 3 main bad guys, each of which has a slightly different motivation. So one of the guys, he's just after money and power. He wants to torture Isaac of York into giving him lots of money. Another one just wants the hand of Rowena. He wants to marry her for political power. He doesn't really care about her specifically, but he wants the power that comes with her connections and her name. And then the third bad guy wants to ravish or possibly marry Rebecca. So 3 different people, 3 different motivations. Ivanhoe is kind of a background in this because he's laid out sick, injured from the tournament. So he really isn't a big part of this to begin with. Anyway, so after the capture and defeat, then there is a third part. So you kind of have the tournament centered around part 1. Part 2 is the capture and rescue in the castle, all that. And then the third part is a trial of Rebecca. So the man who wants to wed her, she keeps refusing him, very strong character, and so he kind of denounces her as a witch, and there's a trial, and somebody has to, through trial of combat, defend her if somebody will show up, and then you have to have all the resolution for all everything that happens with everybody. Okay, that's the plot. It's kind of convoluted because there's so many characters and so many different threads going through. So things that I like about this. So the plot itself, I like that. There's a lot of really interesting things going on. And that does, you keep kind of going, okay, this big plot section is interesting. So the plot itself is good. I liked the familiar characters. You have Robin Hood, like I said, and that's kind of it's almost an Easter egg thrill whenever he shows up. Or at one point you have Friar Tuck, but again, he's not called Friar Tuck. You just recognize him and go, that's gotta be Friar Tuck. And it's just kind of fun. It almost feels like you're discovering things that the characters who are meeting these famous characters don't know who these are. That's pretty fun. Again, Prince John, even though he's not a likable character at all, is kind of fun because you kind of are familiar with him. So that I like that. The humor. So I'm going to quote from the book. And before I do, be warned that the language is not bad language. It's just difficult for a modern reader to follow. That's going to be coming up later. I'll talk about that. So the humor. The humor is subtle. This is not a comedy book at all. And it's not frequent humor, but it is interspersed enough. So this one is kind of an amusing side note. This is right at the beginning. I'm going to quote on page 31 and 32 of the book, and it is, the characters are Wamba, who is a court jester, and Girth, who is a swineherd. He is a slave. He's got a collar that says "Property of Cedric the Saxon" on him. But he's a swineherd, so he's taking care of swine. And finally, they mention Fangs, the dog. Okay, so it starts out, Girth is trying to collect his wandering swine, and he's talking about the dog. "A devil draw the teeth of him," said Girth, "and the mother of mischief confound the ranger of the forest that cuts the forepaws off our dogs and makes them unfit for their trade. Wamba, help me up. Help me, and thou beest a man. Take a turn round the back of the hill to gain the wind on them, and when thou'st got the weather gauge, thou mayest drive them before thee as gently as so many innocent lambs." "Truly," said Wamba, without stirring from his spot, "I have consulted my legs upon this matter, and they are altogether of the opinion that to carry my gay garments through these sloughs would be an act of unfriendship to my sovereign person and royal wardrobe. Wherefore, Girth, I advise thee to call off Fangs. Leave the herd to their destiny, which, whether they meet with the bands of travelling soldiers or of outlaws or of wandering pilgrims, can be little else than to be converted into Normans before morning, and to thy no small ease and comfort." "The swine turned into Normans to my comfort?" quoth Girth. "Expound that to me, Wamba, for my brain is too dull and my mind too vexed to read riddles." "Why, how call you these grunting brutes running about on their 4 legs?" demanded Wamba. "Swine, fool, swine," said the herder. "Every fool knows that." "And swine is good Saxon," said the jester. "But how call you the sow when she is flayed and drawn and quartered and hung up by the heels like a traitor?" "Pork," answered the swineherd. "I am very glad every fool knows that too," said Wamba. "And pork, I think, is a good Norman French. And so, when the brute lives, and is in the charge of a Saxon slave, she goes by her Saxon name, but becomes a Norman, and is called Pork, when she is carried to the castle hall to feast among the nobles. What dost thou think of this, friend Girth, huh?" "It is but too true doctrine, friend Wamba. However, it got into thy fool's pate." Pate? I'm not sure how to pronounce that. "Nay, I can tell you more," said Wamba in the same tone. "There is an old alderman ox, continues to hold his Saxon epithet while he is under the charge of serfs and bondsmen such as thou, but becomes beef, a fiery French gallant, when he arrives before the worshipful jaws that are destined to consume him." Okay, so as you can see there, they're talking about language, which is the conflict between the Saxons and the Normans is a big part of this story, and something I knew nothing about. This is actually another detail about this book. So you kind of saw the humor there. but it also revolves around the history. And it does a lot of describing of the history between the Saxons and the Normans. And although this book is written entirely in English, it refers to both and says people are talking in different languages, whether it's Saxon or Norman, French. It's very interesting because I am not from England. I do not know the history between the Saxons and the Normans, so this was kind of all new to me, so that was educational. But anyway, there's a little bit of humor in there. You can kind of see as Wamba is talking about the idea of naming something, when it wallows as a slave out in the fields, it's Saxon, and when it's, worshipped on the dinner plate, it is Norman, because it is so much elevated there. Interesting. Okay, so the humor I like. Most of the characters are likable, except for the bad guys, who are not likable at all, of course, but the good guys are fairly likable. Wamba and Girth are characters in the story, and it's not just the first chapter or the prologue or anything that they're there. They're there throughout, and they are likable. Cedric the Saxon, Ivanhoe's father, is, I wouldn't say specifically likable, but he is interesting. And that's kind of true for most of the characters. Again, a lot of them are likable, but even if they aren't likable, they're interesting. And the author does a great job of identifying the characters and having them have very unique feel to them. They don't all feel like the same character. That's really nice. I will say, though, that the bad guys can feel a little bit interchangeable. And for me, I had some problems with that because all three of the main bad guys, all like their first names or their last names, I guess, the names that they're called, all have a prominent B in there. It's like Boyce de Gilbert and Font de Boeuf, and I can't even remember what the third one is, de Bracy. So you have prominent B. I just had a problem, like which one was which. Maybe somebody else won't have that problem. But all the other characters outside of those main three, the bad guys, I didn't have any trouble at all differentiating them. There is a satisfying ending to this book. It really does feel good. The bad guys are punished appropriately, I felt like. The good guys get what they want. They triumph in the end. That is a pretty nice ending. Okay, so the tone of this is kind of a romantic view, not romance, but a romantic view of the Middle Ages with chivalry in reach, that people actually behave chivalrously for the most part. Even the rogues like Robin Hood and his merry men tend to behave honorably. And I liked that. I liked that the very high view of honor and courtesy, and that was very prevalent throughout this book. Somebody who does not behave chivalrously is a bad guy. I mean, that's pretty clearly laid out in this. The bad guys do not. They break the rules and are scorned for it. So I liked that. Let's see. There are a couple things about the book that I won't say are negative, but are there and you need to be aware of them. One of this is you kind of need to be pretty familiar with the Bible to understand what's going on. They make lots and lots of references to biblical things. It can just be a couple of sentences referring to an event or a quote or something like that. And if you don't know kind of all the circumstances around that, you may be scratching your head going, what are they? You miss what they're alluding to if you're not familiar with the Bible. Now, I am familiar with the Bible, so I didn't have a problem following it, but somebody who is not, which culturally we are kind of biblically illiterate, so a lot of people probably would not catch a lot of the allusions. So that's not good or bad, it just is. I will say I didn't like, so there's several things I didn't like. One of which would be, this isn't a bad dislike, but I disliked it, was the language. So this is old-fashioned. It was written 200 years ago and takes place much farther back than that. It doesn't quite, but almost has a lot of that, King James, these and thous and whilst. You have things that have different spellings than they would in modern English. For example, somebody sat down. Sat. How do you spell that? S-A-T? Well, in this book, several times it's spelled S-A-T-E. I had to read, you read it and you go, is that a spelling error? But it's several times throughout the book. It's not a typo. It's not an editorial blunder. It's just the way that the language has shifted over time. And apparently 200 years ago, sometimes you could do sat with an E. Who knew? So there are things like that, where you read along and it caused me to stumble. You have to back up and reread it to make sure you understood it, because the language is old-fashioned. So that makes it much slower reading for a modern reader. You have to pay attention to what it is that it's saying. It has a different style also. A lot more rambling style. This is not a tight story. This is an author who rambles on and on about the history behind what's going on in all circumstances. He likes to ramble. And so even something like an action scene, you're kind of like, okay, we're getting to the action scene and this is going to happen. And he may go into the history of jousting or something that you're just like, we haven't gotten to the action yet. So the author does lots of exposition. This does include interjections that are patently from the point of view of the author, which I tend not to like. So, for example, on the language, he will the author talking to the reader saying, it used to be this way, but this is what we do now, or this is something that is still there today and these people live in this castle, or something like that, where he is talking at the reader. And I don't like it when that happens, and it doesn't happen very often, but it is there. Okay, so some stronger things that I dislike. So first would be there are threats of torture for Isaac of York. They're, pretty graphically could be bad. It doesn't actually get to that point, but it could be. And the threats are there. There's threat of sexual assault. So Rebecca, she is a Jewess, a female Jew. And as such, she does not have the protection of name or society or whatever. They're basically like those scum over there. And so she is threatened with sexual assault. Nothing ever happens there, but it's a threat. And there's a lot of those overtones of persecution for the Jews. This is extremely anti-Semitic, especially in regards to Isaac, who's like main chief goal in life is to have all the money. And so it's got a lot of stereotypes towards Jews. Interestingly enough, Rebecca, despite being a Jew, is actually a really good character. Like, the author elevates her character a lot, despite his patent anti-Semitism. So I'm not sure what's going on with that. But this is probably the most anti-Semitic book I have ever read in my life. As far as stereotypes, negative, how horrible Jewish people are or something like that. It's pretty awful. So be aware. I did not love that. So sexual assault, anti-Semitism, we will say anti-feminism too. So there's a lot of chauvinism going on as far as how women are treated. There are two main women. There's Rowena, which is Ivanhoe's lady love, and then Rebecca the Jew. And Rebecca is an amazing character. There's almost nothing negative about her. She's generous and kind, sweet, a strong character. But our women are not going to be, butch, rescue themselves, mega, superheroes. These are damsels in distress, for the most part. They are strong, probably, for the time it was written in the culture, standing up for themselves. But like, for example, Rowena, the author excuses her strength of character. This isn't like you're expected to be a strong woman. Instead, he excuses it saying, well, she was brought up to be pampered in such a way that she felt like she could always get her own way, and that is why she's able to stand up to this horrible, evil man. And then when he goes too far, threatening people, she bursts into tears, inconsolable. And that is basically her character. She is strong up into a point, and then she becomes a weeping mess. So somebody who wants a strong female character, you kind of almost look to Rebecca. And even then, she doesn't rescue herself or anything like that. She just prays for rescue. She is a damsel in distress. So there is that. Okay. There is slavery in this. And this was written at a time period before the abolition in England. So at the time of Ivanhoe's writing, it doesn't even matter about the time it was taking place, but at the time of its writing, slavery was just a common everyday thing. There are slaves of several different races in here, so this is not just black people. And honestly, the slavery is mentioned kind of as a side note. Like you would say if you were writing something about a noble house and they had a maidservant or something like that, and you just mentioned that they came and cleaned the fireplace or put the dishes on the table or whatever it may be. That's kind of how they treat slavery here, where it's just a fact of life and it's just in the background and it happens and whatever. So there is that. There is no negative view of slavery outside of perhaps Girth, who, as I mentioned, is kind of a slave, and he is working to purchase his freedom, and how he wants to be free. But even then, Girth, so he has the opportunity to leave his master behind when his master is captured, and he doesn't. He's like, oh, I'll go back and help him out. Okay, so this is not, slavery in this is kind of looked at as a part of life, and a slave might be perfectly interested in helping his master. So it's not, it is kind of a weird, I think, a modern reader will look at that and kind of think it's a little weird. Okay, my last criticism on this would be the pacing. So I've already kind of mentioned that the rambling, the exposition can get a little bit big. So the pacing on this is not tight and compact and something that you just are eager to get to the next bit. Usually it's kind of, you set it down, at least I felt you could set it down and go walk away and go do something else and kind of go, oh yeah, I should come back and read that. But it's not, you're not looking forward necessarily to the next thing just because the pacing is so slow. And I criticize it based on that. Okay, last thing for Ivanhoe. This would be what I would consider the romance or lack thereof. This is not quite a dislike, but not necessarily a really like. So I thought this was interesting. So this is not a book that has romance in it at all. There's nothing romantic in it as far as what you traditionally think of as romance. So Ivanhoe, which is the name of the book, even though he's not really part of the story for large portions of it, he starts the story already having a romantic connection with Rowena. So Rowena and Ivanhoe are basically committed to each other before the book starts. And they don't have really any interaction pretty much at all throughout the book. Maybe a little bit, but nothing, okay? So you don't get any romance there. And no other characters really have romance except for Rebecca, our Jewish lady. And that would be, she has interaction with Ivanhoe in several respects. And at the very end of the book, it's very clear that Rebecca has fallen in love with Ivanhoe, and Ivanhoe, we'll just say, thinks fondly of her, even though they don't get together. And this is an interesting choice on the author's part, because the audience feels a lot more connection between Rebecca and Ivanhoe than they do between Ivanhoe and Rowena. And so it almost feels like a love triangle, although nothing romantic really happens. You know, Ivanhoe and Rebecca do not get together. Rowena does not get jealous as far as you can tell. I mean, nothing happens. Anyway, the interesting part is there's an author's note or editor's note, somebody gives a note at the end of the book that there were plays and stuff at the height of the book's popularity. There were lots of Broadway shows and stuff of Ivanhoe. And some of them changed the ending. They actually changed the ending so Rebecca converts to Christianity because you can't marry a Jew if you're not a Jew. Both religions at that time would have forbidden it. So she converts to Christianity so she and Ivanhoe can get together. And I thought that was funny, that there was basically, we'll call it fan fiction in the 1800s about Ivanhoe and Rebecca. Okay. My overall grade on this was actually really hard. I give it a lot more grace because it is such an old book, such an old classic. I tend to want to bump up older classics than I would if it was a newly written book. I would have said it was okay because it is a classic. because it is so old, a lot of the things that I dislike about it I feel are excusable because of the era, not necessarily because the writing would be excusable in a modern setting. So like, for example, the treatment of slavery there, if somebody today was writing for a modern era and had that kind of attitude towards that, I'd be like, I don't know about that. Or the anti-Semitism would be awful. I would have given it a total downgrade. But because of when it was written and when it takes place, those things are kind of more forgivable. Therefore, I am going to give this a 2 thumbs up recommendation that people read it. But be aware, it is a little bit more of a slog than I tend to like. It leans right at just okay, mostly for the pacing and how difficult it is to get through the way it's written, more so than for the story itself. It might be a good idea if you attempt to do this, do either like the Wikipedia summary or a children's version of it first. Because if you had a broad outline of the story and then tackle this, you'd probably be a lot more patient to get through some of the slog parts where it's just dialogue endlessly. Okay, on to part 2. So what I'm going to do next is The Terran Privateer by Glenn Stewart. I don't have one to hold up because I have a digital copy of it. So this is a military sci-fi book, or at least somewhat close to that. It's definitely sci-fi. I'm not quite sure whether it's military or not, but that should be fun. So a sci-fi book. So I hope you will join me. Thank you for watching.